to the Indomitable podcast. I'm your host, Stacey Uhrig, and today we have a very special episode that will leave you inspired. My guest today is the indomitable Stacey Uhrig. Stacey Uhrig is a certified trauma recovery coach, speaker, and host of the podcast Flip Your Mindset. She specializes in understanding the impact of childhood and development trauma on adults and helps individuals break free from unresolved emotional wounds. Stacey equips her one-to-one clients in private practice with practical tools and insights to reframe their narratives, fostering greater joy and connection in their lives. Using modalities like hypnosis and rapid transformational therapy, she helps clients gain clarity and self-empowerment, enabling them to find peace and purpose in their healing journey. Wow, that is a fantastic bio. Hello, Stacey. I'm so grateful to have you here. Thank you
I'm
so much
so grateful to be had. Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
Y'all, I first met Stacey when I was on her podcast earlier this year, and I was just so moved by her incredible journey and the lessons she had to offer. So I cannot wait to share this conversation with you today. Oh, so exciting. All right. So before we get too far off track here and just like I go off and ask all the questions I have for you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to here?
Sure. So I am, as you mentioned, I should say I do, because I am as just a person,
Yes.
but I always am trying to be like, you are not what you do. You are who you are. But for work, what I do is I'm a trauma recovery coach. And I think like most trauma recovery coaches, we come into it from the own wisdom that we gain from our own stories. I would say, am I allowed to curse on your podcast? You
Please
curse?
do.
Oh, from my own shit show, And so, I just think we all come into it having learned so much that we can't help but want to know everything about what we experience. So we have better language for it. So then we can help other people for it.
That is so true. Yeah, absolutely. So you got to this place in a very organic way, is what I'm hearing. So you came up through your own stuff and you're now helping other people on their journeys. I love that. So, what is the most common thing people come to you with?
It's so interesting. I was just thinking about this today. I primarily work with women, though I do work with men every year. Most of my business is referral, and women refer women typically. And what I've noticed recently is you would think as a trauma recovery coach, I would see a lot of violence, a lot of acts of aggression, a lots of abuse.
Yeah.
And I do see those things, and those things can be very, very traumatic. But what I see more than often is silence over violence. So what that means to me is so many women coming to me so stuck because they grew up in environments where silence was the killer. It was feeling unseen, feeling unheard, feeling unimportant, feeling insignificant, because their parents could not meet their needs, the needs that needed to be met, that were required to be met, because they had their own stuff that they hadn't worked through, right? So parents who don't know how to connect, parents who don't know how to relate. So there's either disengagement from the parent's part, or the child is becoming the parent early on.
Yes.
Right. And so the silence over violence is like so in my head right now, because the majority of what I see is women coming to me who don't feel enough, who are having a hard time in relationships because they don't know how to relate, who have gotten stuck in the cycle of the people pleasing and the lack of boundary setting and the inability to show up authentically for fear of further silencing and further abandonment.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So like a lot of eldest daughter syndrome, would you say? Like a lot of like people
I mean, they're not necessarily eldest daughter. They can be anywhere in the sibling lineup. But, adults, I tend to work, I have clients as young as 20, and I have clients as old as 75. But I would say that the majority of my clients are somewhere between 38 and 58. Where like the shit just hit the fan, and whatever coping strategies they had in place, like the people pleasing, the lack of boundary setting, what have you, worked until a point where now it's not working anymore, and they're unfulfilled and they're unhappy. And nobody that they've worked with up to this point has helped them connect the dots to where they are today back to where it began.
Yes. Oh, I'm hearing that so much that it works till it doesn't, right? So that like when we hit that burnout wall where suddenly everything that we are working on never doesn't work anymore. I was talking to a friend of mine this morning and I was telling her how like I work best when I have like this tiny bit of anxiety, and I call it like simmer mode, when I'm dealing with like a tiny bit of anxiety, but not like a lot of anxiety. But if my anxiety crashes into my burnout, then we're not going anywhere. Then it's just time to shut down everything, because now it's time to think about how we're behind on everything and we're terrible, right? So, oh my God, yes, absolutely.
And, you were on my podcast, so I have and I read your book, so I have a really good sense of, your story.
Yes.
And I could see how there's a part of you, and I do a lot of parts work, that creates anxiety as a way to stay hypervigilant.
Yes.
Always. Right?
Absolutely.
But that is an exhausting state of being. I lived in that state from probably age 13 until age 33. And it was my normal. I didn't know.
Yes.
I didn't know that anything else was available.
No. I mean, you talk to people and they're just like, oh, I'm tired, or I'm this, or I'm that. And I'm like, oh, okay. So everybody feels tired. Everybody feels overwhelmed. Everybody feels whatever. And then more and more, when I talk to other women, especially, they have sort of the same feedback about my life. So it kind of makes you feel like that's normal. And then you talk to people like yourself, of course, who just knows me so much better because you read the book and you know me from other things. Like, you're just going to sit here and be like, no, Di, that's not the way to live. That's not, that's not real. That's not realistic. What do you tell people like me when they get to that place where they're just like, this has been my normal. I'm 40 years old now. This has been my normal forever.
So the first thing I would say is, do you want to change it? I mean, look, like, this is why I'm not going to assume that people would want to change.
Oh, I mean, yes. Let's assume. Yes. You know what? Let's assume for the podcast episode that Di is capable of change. Let's go with that.
Yes, you are capable of change. We're all capable of change. And what I do is, if someone had come to me and said, listen, I've tried everything and I just can't get out of this state of being, but it's robbing me of joy because I can't relax.
Yeah.
That's when I would recommend perhaps doing this rapid transformational therapy, which is done under hypnosis, because what we can do is we can start to identify where, when, how, and why this part came to be in your space. So I really am all about internal family systems, parts work, with this idea of we're all born with this self energy that is calm and confident and curious and creative and, compassionate and connected. And when we're those things, we're not going to be anxious.
Yeah.
So when we're born, you have 2 little kids, right? Yeah. When they're born, they're just this little ball of love and light. They might be colicky, they might be whatever, but they're kind of just like this mushy sack of just energy. And they don't have opinions, and they haven't had experience yet to start to shape shift or maybe shed authentic pieces of themselves, right? So they're still in this authentic, what is called self energy, and they're self-led. And then over time, sometimes very quickly, sometimes it starts in the womb, we start to identify the way I'm showing up is not getting me what I need, because we only need a handful of things.
Right.
Food, water, shelter, keep me clean. But equally important, maybe more important than all of it, is I need to know I belong here. I need to know I connect. I need to know I'm a part of, and I'm enough to be. And as soon as that starts to feel threatened, the amygdala goes on in our brain, and everything starts to get wonky, and we find ourselves harnessing coping strategies that I see as different parts of ourselves.
Yes.
Right? Yes. And these parts are all benevolent. They're all trying to help you feel something different than what it is that you're feeling.
Absolutely.
Right? Which is usually something rooted in some sort of fear.
Of course.
And what I would say is there's a part of you that is anxious, and we would go back and find out when and why and how that part developed.
Yeah.
Right? And then give it a chance to make a different decision for you. Maybe give it a chance to be less active in your system, because typically these parts don't really recognize how resourced you are now. They're kind of stuck in like a time warp. So if you harness that part, say when you were 18 months old or 2 years old, and we're in dialogue under hypnosis, and somehow this part realizes that you're not that age.
Yes. Yes.
There's a sense of, oh, oof, well, that feels good. I kind of feel relieved because I'm exhausted.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I'm in conversation with like my highest self super regularly. Like every time I'm freaking out, I'm like, okay, this is ridiculous. We need to calm down now, because we are now 40 and not any more longer in that state of like, fight or flight mode. But
That's right.
It's so hard to grow out of it. Right.
Well, let me give you a tip. So that is what we do. We quickly identify when there's a part of us, and I use this terminology part because we all use it. There's a part of me that wants to go for a walk. There's a part of me that wants to sit on the couch. There's a part of me that wants to relax. And then there's a part of me that wants to keep busy. Like, we use this language all the time.
Yes.
What we do is when these parts come forward, we quickly, as you just mentioned, want to kick it to the curb.
Yes.
Right? So we want to be like, just shut up and just do.
Yes.
And just like a toddler, if a toddler is trying to get your attention and you ignore it or you quiet it, it gets louder and throws a bigger tantrum. So our parts are the same way. When we sense that we're not in our flow, when we're not connected to self, when we're not in that calm, authentic state that we have the capability of being, even if you haven't had it for a really, really, really long time, we all have the capability. It's just quiet.
Yes. Yeah.
What I teach people is we don't want to quiet our part that's coming forward. We don't want to shut it up. Right. We want to dialogue with it. Hey, I see you're here. I see you're here. I can feel you, right? We have this anxiety, this sensation. What do you got for me? What is it that I need to know? I know that you're here for my benefit.
Yes.
And if you're intuitive enough, you kind of hear it.
Of course. Yeah.
And the idea here is to create some space, not to be so enmeshed with the part. Create some space. Give it a chance to be heard and seen.
Right. Right.
And acknowledge it and thank it. And then you can say, I get it. Thank you. Not right now. Just like we would with a toddler. The more you try to shut it up, the louder and fiercer it's going to get.
Oh, so that's what's happening, is what you're telling me.
Pretty much.
And I'm like, okay, let's keep going. We're gonna play Hurt, and then that's just not working out.
No.
Oh, okay.
Not gonna work out. Yeah.
Shocker. I feel shocked that my coping strategies are not the best. So how would you say, do you deal or do you work with a lot of people who are parents? I would feel like that's something you would run into the wall faster, right? Like, I feel like becoming a mother probably, so like my coping strategies worked better when it was just me. And they're terrible coping strategies, to be clear. I mean, Stacey's read my book. My strategies were not great up to a point, right? So like even now I'm still learning. But are you finding that the people who are drowning the fastest, let's say, are other parents?
They are other parents who have not acknowledged that they have their own shit. And they're parenting through the shit. That's the difference. Okay. Yes. So our children are our greatest teachers, and there's no coincidence to the children that we bear. In my case, my children are adopted, right? So our children are our greatest gift and our greatest challenge. Absolutely. And our greatest teacher. And they often shine a light on and put a mirror to our own work. And so if you have someone who, I have a lot of parents, there's two scenarios that I have. I have a lot of parents that are just overwhelmed because again, the coping strategies that they've used in life no longer serve them. And they're dealing with other human beings' shit. So when you can
Absolutely.
barely cope with your own, and now you're being forced to cope with your own and somebody else's, and they're fully
Mm.
relying on you, it
Mhm.
is a collapsed state, right? So we
Of
can be
course.
working on how do we clear out your own shit to make
Yes.
room and space for you to be able to hold it for others, number one. Number
Yes.
two, I think just like anything, God, the universe, whatever you believe in, kind of just brings you whoever you're meant to have.
Mm.
Right. So
Mhm.
I've always believed in my business as a
Yep.
coach that the right people will be brought to me that
Yes.
need whatever knowledge I have, and vice
Right.
versa, those
Yeah.
that I need to learn from. And so I
Mhm.
tend to work with a lot of parents of children who either are adopted
Mm.
or are neurodivergent,
Mhm.
because I have experience here.
Right.
And that is an extra stressor because we don't always take the time to gain knowledge to, or even know that we need to gain knowledge to the
Right.
impact that these things have on our children. So we're trying to parent X when we really have Y.
Yes.
And we're
Yeah.
frustrated that we're trying to parent X because it's not working the way that we think it should. Should
Mhm.
is, the operative word here. And we're
Right.
trying to kind of throw a peg into a square.
Right.
And I can really support parents in a unique way that say,
Mhm.
let's look at how you're doing this. Why are you doing it this way?
Mhm.
And what would it look like if we took a little shift?
Mhm.
And, sometimes they don't even know that shifting is available, but what they're feeling is a lot of shame in their parenting
Yes.
because they
Absolutely.
don't understand why the way that they're approaching parenting isn't work.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. God, that's always the worst. Um, I mean, as you well know, that was my experience when I had my kids. At first, I was like, oh, okay, I will just learn everything there is to know about children, and that will save me, right? And then that's just not it at all, because it's absolutely an exercise in letting go of control, which, as I always say, is not my favorite level. I really like the control. It's a false sense of security. It makes me feel
Yeah.
like I can control every variable around me. But parenting was absolutely the opposite of that, right? So, like, not only you are fed this, let's say, narrative that when you have a child, regardless of how you come to them, they are completely a blank slate, and that your parenting is going to inform who they become as people. And maybe to some extent, your parenting does inform who they become as people, but they are coming to us fully coded. Like, they have their own ideas, they have their own feelings, their own agendas, their own goals for this lifetime, if you will. So it stunned me when I first had my kids how similar to me they were and yet how different. I thought I was going to have two little versions of myself that liked all the same things and we were going to share all that stuff and no, not at all. So I think what I ran into first was just the differences that I could not emotionally ignore. I needed to be able to be there for them in a way that people hadn't been for me. And
Right.
that was a huge gap to close. And I think that we assume that people are right and that however we parent them is who they become, and that's absolutely fake. So, how did you feel about, like, when you became a parent? How did that impact your practice? How did that impact your belief system? I'm sure you came into this world with just as many fake beliefs as the rest of us get dipped
Yeah.
in. How have you changed over time, would you say?
Well, I mean, certainly, I think similar to you, we observed how we were parenting, what worked, what didn't work,
Right.
and decided that we would forge our own path.
Of course.
Right. And
Yes.
then we think that that's going to be the right path. And we do know
Mhm.
our children best.
Yes.
But from that experience, I always made sure that my children knew that they'd be protected, that they were going to be heard, seen,
Mhm.
valued as important,
Yes.
and that they would be a big part of the equation,
Of course.
not an afterthought or a situation in which they're not being considered. Right.
Right. Right.
But then as I was parenting and I could see the impact that having been adopted had, because just like you were saying, like, I just assumed, do X. Well, I just assumed. And part of it was because this was what I was told.
Yes.
Love is all. Love is all you need. Love is enough. And, I didn't understand the impact the foster care system had on my children. It was not something that was discussed.
Really?
When we were, no, it really wasn't. My did not do a domestic adoption. I did international adoption, and I've had enough conversation with enough adoptive parents at this point where we're all like, yeah, no, like that was not shared. What was really focused on, because these were international adoptions, was racism and prejudice, and to be very, very aware, especially if you had a non-white child coming into your family, which was the case for us.
Right.
However, that being said, there was really nothing taught in these classes, and I'm putting classes in quotes, that we had to attend about attachment and connection and anything that might have been ruptured prior to us becoming parents. And so we kind of went in super naive. And as I've learned more about that has informed my practice, and that has allowed me to either help clients of mine who are adopted who actually haven't connected dots on that yet for themselves, or parents of adopted children that are coming to me for their own challenges, but then it's being compounded by whatever shame they're feeling through parenting or frustration that they're feeling because there's a missing layer of information.
Right. Oh my goodness. I can't imagine. Well, I can. I was going to say, I can't imagine that they would just put kids in homes without giving anybody anything. And then, no, wait, I can.
Yeah. I mean, look, I knock on wood. Yeah. We had a very healthy home for our children to come into. And I think we really just assume all children need love, and love's enough, and love will fix all. And that was a huge learning curve for us. Yes. And I think I wouldn't have done anything differently ever. But what it would have allowed me is a different lens through which to see some of the things that I was seeing, and to allow me to advocate and fight for my kids earlier on, because I would have had a basis for why. Absolutely. Versus me just sitting around going, I don't understand what I'm looking at, and not actually, no therapist, nobody was guiding me. I had to figure this all out on my own. Yes. So it was a real learning curve, but I'm kind of glad I went through it, because it allows me to be a better parent and allows me to really help a unique set of people on their own healing journey, Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I say that all the time. I wouldn't change anything. I mean, I would.
It's crazy, right?
As crazy as it was, once you know, and then, you kind of become the person you needed, right? Like you end up becoming the person that you needed to guide you through this experience. And that's another whole fun level of life, laughing at you.
But that really is the truth.
Yes.
That really is the truth.
Absolutely. I always find that as well. What I wanted to, so I grew up with ADHD. I've always known I was ADHD. There's never been any confusion about that. I've always been very aware, but my version of finding out late had more to do with people not understanding what was going on with me and me not understanding how to communicate it. So, I talk to a lot of people who have like late diagnosis trauma, wherein they are used to the rejection of sort of people having, air quotes here, having to deal with us. So you also are a neurodiversity expert.
And I don't know if I'm an expert, but I've lived it. Right.
We are certainly neurodiversity parenting experts, accidentally or, on purpose.
Yeah.
What you just said, learning how to advocate better for my kid, and that made me think, because honestly, even as I was coming up, I didn't have advocates. So I learned how to advocate for my children in this system that we all live in. And I wondered, did you sort of have that same experience? Did you have that experience learning on the job so as to be the advocate your child needed?
Yes. And I was received with a lot of pushback.
Of course.
And that was really frustrating because once you could see exactly what's going on and you now have a clearer understanding of all the challenge you've been looking at. This is if you have a late diagnosis, right? There's some anger because you're like, Jesus, like I have your, like you're expecting some level of competency. So let's just say it's a school district.
Right.
If the school district's coming to me and saying there's a challenge, and then I say, well, I'm sure it's not the first time you've seen it. What do you do with this challenge?
Yes.
And the response is, well, your kid's the problem. So just try harder, do this, do that, do the other thing.
Right. Do the thing that
I'm expecting that if there is a challenge and you're the child development expert, you're going to alert me.
Yes,
so the fact that I had to figure this out on my own, and then that was all confirmed.
Right.
And then I just simply wanted what was rightfully my child's right for services, and then was just blatantly flat out denied for years.
Yes. Yes.
You become a fierce advocate, but then you were also gaslit to be told that you are the problem.
Yes. Absolutely.
And I'm not one to be backed into a corner.
Nope.
So, it was a very painful experience. But the fierce advocacy was required. And, I'll always fight for the kids to be seen as valuable as everybody else and as important as everybody else. And the desire and need to be seen, heard, understood, regardless how information is processed. You are not what you do. You are who you are.
That's right. Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so if your job, let's just say it's a school district's job is to provide a free and appropriate education. That's a federal law.
Yeah.
Then you need to do it for everyone.
Right. No, absolutely. I completely agree. We had a very similar experience when we were first going through first grade. I had started flagging things for the attention, and to be clear, we live in Massachusetts. So like as good as it can be, that's where it's at. So anything that I run into, I always know that I am still getting the best of like what's possible in the US, right? When it comes to the, the public school systems and whatnot. But when I first started running into it, it was immediately like, oh no, he doesn't qualify for these services.
Same.
And yet everybody that I was running into that was dealing with him day to day was like, you need to deal with this. And of course we were in the middle of a pandemic. He was going to kindergarten, online. So as I was noticing these things about him, I'm immediately flagging it for the attention of like the professionals, quote unquote, around me. And I'm immediately being, just gaslit. That's not right. That's not real. That's not, you're wrong about this. Oh, you might be too sensitive. You might need to, parent him better. Have you tried yelling? Yelling and hitting work. I turned out fine, like that kind of thing. And you're like,
yep,
this is all fake. Because I remember being a kid like 5 minutes ago and I didn't respect anybody that hit me. So like, are you sure that's where we want to land on that? I had a conversation with like a child psychologist who swore to me up and down that like I was explaining parts of ADHD and she rolled her eyes at me. Like she was like, no, I'm like,
well, this is part of the problem because, I used to, 30 years ago. So 1995, so 28 years ago, I was a speech therapist at the time, and I worked with the autistic population exclusively.
Yes.
And, 28 years ago, in 1994, autism was not understood, and quote unquote, the spectrum was not understood the way that it is today.
And that is really saying something because we still aren't there yet.
Yes. Well, it is like greatly improved. So just imagine how bad it was.
That's depressing.
I do believe that we're now in that tipping point for ADHD. I think that it is not understood.
No.
I think that, and we can talk about this in a second, but I think that because it's not understood, and a large number of people misuse the system in order to get services for their children to give them an upper hand. So when you're thinking middle school, high school, or I want my child to have extra time on tests, I want my child to have better grades. And so therefore, I'm going to get them a diagnosis from a pediatrician, let's just say, so they can get this upper hand, really has been a hindrance for kids that really do need the extra support, who are not being diagnosed by a pediatrician with a checklist, but actually going through 12 or 6 hours of diagnostic testing.
Yes.
When those children cannot get services, which is criminal, by the way, let's just call it what it is.
Yeah.
It's a real problem because it sends the message still to the child. So you're not enough.
Yeah.
Even with this, it's not enough.
Absolutely.
So, I think that I'm hoping that in 20 years, and this is sad that I'm saying 20 years, people will understand ADHD much better.
Yes.
There will be a level of respect. There will be a letter of understanding. There will be a level of acknowledgement that this is not to give an upper hand. This is to level a playing field.
Right.
So if I'm in a classroom where the air is whirring and people are outside, doing the leaves, and there's someone walking down the hallway and somebody behind me chewing a piece of gum and somebody in front of me tapping a pencil, and I'm attending to all of it.
Yes.
And I have a scratchy throat.
Yes.
Right. And I have a scratchy throat.
And we can feel,
and it's hot in here.
Yes.
And everything feels, hypersensitivity.
Right.
And I'm supposed to be listening, and being able to take notes. People think that's bullshit. It's not bullshit.
Right.
I also believe, and this is, I'm careful when I say this because it's a somewhat understood theory. It's not one I developed. And I think it's starting to get more fee and a wider audience. But this is the first time I saw it was through Gabor Mate, who's a trauma specialist, and he wrote a book called Scattered Minds. And the idea behind this theory is if we have lived in environments that are unpredictable, chaotic, where we feel unseen, unheard, unimportant, insignificant, unsafe, and our amygdala needs to be engaged, which is our alarm center of our brain. When our amygdala is engaged, which is where you get your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, then your prefrontal cortex goes offline. They cannot be engaged at the same time. Your prefrontal cortex is where you have all of your executive function. It's where you have your emotional regulation. When it's not working, it is, for all intents and purposes, everything on the checklist for ADHD. So you're in some way, shape, or form almost training your brain to go offline, especially if freeze is your coping strategy of choice. So why would freeze be a coping strategy of choice? Well, if you're in a scenario at a very young age where you cannot flee and you cannot fight, and you cannot fawn yourself out of it, so you can't people please, you can't talk your way out of it, your only option of survival in that moment is to freeze, paralyze yourself. It's leaving your body, really. It's disengaging mentally and physically from the environment because it's too much to take in. So now you're training yourself to do that.
To dissociate.
To disassociate, correct. And so that in many, many ways is the mimicking of ADHD. It is all the symptomology of ADHD. So the question is, which came first, right? Like it's almost impossible to tell, but seeing a big picture, if that's the case for somebody, it's really important to understand that you're not just looking at a school issue.
Right.
Whether or not it came from, I'm going to put in quotes, trauma, or let's just call it adverse experiences.
Yes.
Okay. Whether or not it did or did not, to just assume it's a school issue and to not assume that other parts of life are affected, it just looks like a school issue because that's what you get. That's where you get graded. That's where you see the effect. That's where you have a qualifier.
Right.
That's where you have a guide of measurement. You don't have a guide of measurement in life for rejection sensitivity, for how you relate to people, for how you relate to yourself, for how you take in your environment, for how you feel stimulated or understimulated. There's no grade for that.
No. And it's the only place that you can be compared to other people, right? Like that are your same age, your same grade, your same experiences generally. So that's when we start noticing it first, because even if you're just talking about your own kids in your own house, two kids don't seem the same, don't act the same, grow differently, and all of those things. So I always say that when I volunteer a lot at my kids' elementary school because ADHD. So whenever I'm there, I'm always just so aware of how my 8-year-old is different from the other 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds that are experiencing the same sorts of things that he's experiencing. And rather than feel like, oh, well, he's just doing the best or doing the worst or any of those things, I just have more of an awareness of what it looks like when people are or are not sort of aware of their neurodiversity, because that's something that we run into a ton there. Another thing that's a problem is the fact that I have a lot of times when I'll run into a kid that's obviously dealing with neurodiversity, I'll like give the teacher the look like, oh, this looks very familiar to my brain, and they'll be like, oh no, we know, but like their parents won't deal with it because So how do we deal with that as people? How do we overcome that?
Again, and this is, this really goes back to what you asked me earlier, which is, what do I do? Or, who am I? What do I do? Right?
Yes.
We learn so early on to align our child's enoughness with how they show up, how they navigate, how they do.
Yes.
Okay. And so how well do they do in school? How well do they do in sports? How well they did on that exam? How well do they talk to people? How well do they show up in a social setting? How well do they sit down in a restaurant? This is all action. It's all behavior.
Yes.
You are not your behavior. You
No.
are not how you show up in the world. You are your soul, basically.
Right.
So when parents, when they deny a child their reality.
Yes.
They're basically saying, I expect X and you're not giving me X. And I'm usually, I'm going to just fear you into giving me X.
Yes.
I'm going to shame you into giving me X. I'm going to withdraw affection until you give me X. I'm going to tell you you're wrong. I'm telling you try harder, try smarter. You're just lazy. Stop procrastinating. You're unmotivated. I'm going to tell you whatever I can. I'm going to grasp at everything to fear you into doing it.
Right.
And guess what? It's not going to work because it's not behavioral. It's neurological.
Right.
And so now what you're doing is creating yourself a rupture. So to parents who are afraid of, I'm going to put in quotes, the label, what are you really afraid of?
Right.
Because whatever it is that you think your child's not going to get, they're not getting it anyway.
Right. They're already not getting that. Exactly.
Right. So they're afraid socially they're going to have a problem. This is going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. People are going to look at them differently, or I'll even hear bullshit like it's going to hurt their college applications. Honestly, if you don't help your kid out now, my friend, whoever's listening that's questioning it, you think all of a sudden they're going to like take the cape off and do fine in college? No. If you don't start as early as you possibly can and help them learn how to resource and help them learn how to get the language around what they're experiencing and help them learn how to gain agency and advocacy for themselves.
Yes.
College ain't going to look so great.
Right. No, absolutely. It's always stunning to me that like people would rather believe that the issue is behavioral and they can shout their way out of it rather than just know, oh, wait, maybe it isn't me. Maybe it isn't them. Maybe it isn't anything. Maybe
But
it's
you
this
know what
specific
part of
thing,
the problem is?
Yes.
So part of the problem is they want to put blame somewhere.
Yes.
So if there's acknowledgement, then the next thing that they feel they have to answer is, well, how did that happen? Where did they get that from? Whose fault is it?
Wow.
Right? We see,
Yes.
right? Does that relate?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
So now we're in the blame. Right. We're now in the blame game. So part of the reason sometimes where parents don't want that acknowledgement, either one parent is fighting it or the other parent's fighting for the child, or both parents are fighting it, because they don't want to then introspectively look within and say, hey,
yeah,
I struggle with this too.
Yes. Welcome to the fact that it's usually genetic. Yes. Wow. Wow. So they are afraid to not only have the stigma for the child, but accept the acknowledgement that they might have struggled with those things as well. That's
because
very
remember,
foreign.
If you're struggling, so here's the thing, like you were saying, it's genetic, and I'm not saying it's not the case, but there's debate there.
Of
course. Because if
there's not enough research.
Well, if we're training ourselves in this threat theory that I brought up earlier, okay, then there's also some parents that'll be like, well, screw you, because now what are you saying? Right? But the reality is if we are unhealed parents dealing with our own shit,
yes,
and we're not showing up in a way that allows our child to feel, again, seen, heard, understood, valued, significant, important.
Right.
Things happen in our brain, right? Our mind and body's jobs are to keep us safe.
Right.
And so it's not about the blame game. It's just about saying, hey, I did the best with what I could when I had it.
Right. Right.
And now I know better, so I can do better.
Right.
And I can see that my child is struggling here. It doesn't really matter how it got there.
Right. Right.
But I can see, and they matter enough that I want to be able to support and help level the playing field.
Right. That's so. See, I always thought my ADHD made me a superhero. Like, my brain works faster. I can think about a lot of things at once. I read really fast. Like, I learn languages quickly. So, like, I can predict the ending to everything. Like, I can read the vibes in a room. I am practically psychic when it comes with dealing with people. And yet people will be like, oh, well, you shouldn't talk about it so much. People are going to feel bad for you. I'm like, oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. And yet, I will have people who come to me and say, Di, because you talk about ADHD so much, I started listening and I found out that I am ADHD as well. And it's like, how am I the first person you've run into that has had this conversation with you,
Because there's a lot of stigma.
Yes.
Because
which
there's a lot of
to me.
Yeah, because listen, here's what I can say, just because I've read your book and I had you on my podcast. You were not relying on the opinion of other people at a very early age to determine who you were and how valuable you were.
Right.
Okay.
True.
But many, the majority, let's just say, of humans as young children,
yes,
are relying on other people to tell them if they are good enough or not good enough. And if they're learning different and if they're processing different, the fear is, if that's happening now, what's going to happen then? And let's not address it. Just plow through it. Just figure out a way. No one's sitting down and saying, well, let's harness the superpower with the child. Or I shouldn't say nobody, but let's just say in my generation, that wasn't the case, right? I'm 52. It's not the way that we did things. And by the way, our parents' generation certainly didn't.
Even worse.
And it didn't start, right? It didn't start with our generation.
No.
So it's a complicated situation. It doesn't really matter the chicken or the egg, to be honest. The reality is if we can see our children simply process the world in a way that can overwhelm their system.
Yes. Yes.
And we have the opportunity to give them a way to be able to process the world feeling less overwhelmed. That's what we need to be able to do. And the behaviors are just a symptom of the overwhelm.
Right. 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 That is a rough truth. So, I want to talk to you a little bit about the medication shortage since we're on the neurodiversity track. I have sort of gotten a lot of feedback from folks that don't know that the reason we have this shortage is because all these college kids that never had ADHD, all these folks who never had ADHD, ADHD was never a thing in my generation, there's so many people now. So I feel like the first thing we fight is that first, like, this isn't a real thing, right? And the second level of that, which is really the more dangerous one, is when we're for example, I ran into a pharmacist when I was trying to get my medication for my 8-year-old. And basically, she looked over at me and she was like, "Is it for her?" And guy was like, "Yep." And he's like, "Oh, well, we're not going to have any meth for like at least another." And I was like, "Ma'am, you should not be a pharmacist over here at my local CVS. I can tell you that, like, immediately." So my thought here is not even just like that we're dealing with it didn't used to be a thing, but like that you have to look a certain way or act a certain way or be visibly different, air quotes, right? Visibly different for people to believe that you are worthy of medication, right? So it's not even just the shortage. It's the narratives around the shortage. It's the people who are contributing to gatekeeping around the medication for no reason. And I'm fascinated to hear your theories about sort of why we're here. I mean, not pharmaceutically, but like, what do you think about my theory? What do you think about
look, I think it's very, very unfortunate that there is a shortage, and it bumped up against us for sure. I will also say that we were at a crossroads ourselves where the medication really wasn't effective. And so now I was trying really hard to get a medication that wasn't really fully effective to begin with.
Right.
And so we started trying other medications, but what I was finding was each one was equally harder to get than the next.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so we went 3 years without having any problems getting the medication. I had already started thinking maybe we should switch it. When we started having a hard time getting it, it created that urgency. Okay, I've been thinking about switching it. Maybe now is the time because I can't get it anyway.
Right.
Which was about a year ago, maybe a little bit. Yeah, about a year ago. We tried 2 other medications. One broke him out in hives and one made him very sick. So I was like, okay, indicator. Now, to your point about the colleges, look, the whole thing is so complicated. I was avoiding, a heavy stimulant because I did have a son getting ready to go to college. And I was like, that just looks like a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely.
But we ended up going that route because he was 18 and he was like, nothing else has worked. And my friends that struggle with ADHD, they're telling me nothing worked for them either, except for this. So I said, listen, you're 18. I'd rather be a part of the process than not be a part of the process. So if that's the way you think we should go, we should go. Interestingly enough, my greatest fear was that somebody would come in and steal it, or somebody would want to buy it from him, or whatever it is. He's not even barely using it. He still has much more than I anticipated he would still have starting from June, and it's October, November. And his feeling is the kids that need it are taking it. He's never been approached by anybody to get it or to have it. So I think my biggest fear and the myth I was running through my head was dispelled pretty quickly, knock on wood.
Yeah.
But look, I think the whole thing with medication is very, very complicated. There is a stigma around it. There's not a stigma around other medications, so I don't know why this is such a challenge. Again, because I think people think it's behavioral and not neurological.
Of course. Yes, of course.
Okay. Unless you've had a child with ADHD or you've had ADHD yourself, you would understand that nobody needs to suffer.
Right.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't think that the medical community is very well versed. It's hard to say, but they're just not.
Like 30 years later, this is for me, Stacey. Like 30 years later, we're still having this conversation. And it's like,
yeah. But even, the theory I brought up earlier, I brought that theory up to our family psychiatrist. And I said, listen, now we've tried 4 medications here. What if this theory is accurate?
Right.
And this is the reason why it's not working, because you're trying to put a Band-Aid over a fucking bullet hole.
Literally.
Like, we're not actually treating the right thing. We're just treating a symptom of something bigger. Right. And I explained this theory to him, and he said, you just described 3 other clients that I have, 3 other patients.
Yeah.
And he said, I need more information on this theory. He, our psychiatrists, I dare to say many therapists, not all, but the majority, they're not trauma trained.
Nope.
And if you have a good one, they'll admit to you that that's the fact. Right. It's not a part of their curriculum. If you find somebody that is, it's because they took the time, the money, the effort, the energy to go and get trained in that specifically, because it's not a part of a mental health curriculum. Shocker.
Yep.
But when you're treating the symptom of something and you're not treating the root cause.
Yes.
Right. And so getting back to your question of like, we do have more diagnoses. Well, why? Is it because people are more willing to talk about it now?
Yes.
Is it because, right? Like, I mean, there's so many different reasons why. I hear a lot of people say, oh, it's the technology. It's social media is the problem. I hear this all the time. And I was like, no, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think our children who are prone to ADHD are put into a ringer because now everything requires a shorter attention span and there is more to attend to. And that is very challenging.
Yes.
But I don't believe it's the cause.
No, I agree. Yeah, we've had that conversation in community about trauma brain being nearly indistinguishable from neurodiversity.
That's right.
And you are absolutely right. We have that conversation pretty regularly, in these circles. I agree. So what do I want to ask you? I want to ask you, how do you help people like yourself who are potentially dealing with, who are adoptive parents? I have a lot of people that follow me because of the foster care stuff and want to become foster parents, want to become adoptive parents. What's like one great takeaway? I know that's going to be impossible. Right?
It's a big one, yeah.
More specific because that's none of my business. But what's one great takeaway that you wish someone had potentially told you?
Gosh, how would I want to say this? You're being gifted the opportunity to raise a human being. Yeah. Whether you're adopting or you're giving birth, or they come by way foster care, or they come by way kinship, it doesn't matter. You're being gifted an opportunity to help a child realize their greatness.
Yes.
But some of those children, based on whatever lived experience they have before they come to you, are going to have perceptions about themselves, about the world around them that have nothing to do with you, but you're going to feel it has everything to do with you. Yes. You're going to take it personally. Do not take it personally.
Yes.
The goal is to hold a safe space. Yes. Where you can help your child gain language to what it is that they're feeling. So often, knock on wood, I did not have this challenge, thank goodness, but I do work with a lot of families who are experiencing a lot of behavioral issues with their children. And they take it so personally, and they take it as a ding against their ability to parent. It gives them a lot of shame with regard to parenting. And, what I would say is it's really important to become aware. Radical awareness is huge, that something doesn't feel right, that you're really like up against a fight all the time.
Yeah.
If that's the case, I would start doing your homework, right? So there's a couple of books I would highly recommend that are on my bookshelf. One of them is The 7 Core Principles of Adoption and Permanency.
Yes.
It's not an easy book to read because there's a lot of painful truths in the book, but it's very important to understand what is going on with your child. If your child is showing up in a way that doesn't seem right to you, then you should follow that lead. And not always listen to, I'm going to put in quotes, the experts.
Oh, so true.
Because they don't necessarily know. Okay.
Yeah.
So follow your gut and do your own research and become the loudest megaphone and the loudest advocate. The other book that has been one of my favorite books of all time is called What Happened to You. And it's written by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And what I love about that book is it is very easy to read on a very difficult topic. It is basically a conversation between the two. If you listen to it on Audible, it's like an 8-hour conversation podcast. It's not anybody reading a book. It's a conversation between Bruce Perry, who's, a pediatric specialist, developmental pediatrician, and Oprah Winfrey. And they're really talking about stop looking at the behavior and start asking why. Stop looking at what's happening and start asking what happened that's causing this child to show up in whatever way that it is that they're showing up. If you're not in a position where you're having a lot of behaviors, but you are a new adoptive parent, or maybe you are starting into the foster care realm, I highly recommend these 2 books. If someone had told me to read The 7 Core Principles of Adoption and Permanency as a requirement to my adoption, it would have scared the shit out of me, but it would have prepared me. I wouldn't have done it any differently.
No.
Ever, but it would have prepared me and given me language. And understanding. So then I could have been able to share the language and understanding with my own family.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Agree. So important to develop that language of advocacy within any situation that you're in. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So, as I am always saying, I'd love this conversation to go on forever, but we need to let Stacey get back to changing the world because she's doing such important work. I'm sure everyone would love to hear more about how they can follow you, or get in touch or keep in touch. How do they do that best?
Yeah. So I'm very active on Instagram. I really use Instagram as an educational platform with a little bit of my life sprinkled in, but it's mostly educational. And that's just my name, Stacey Uhrig. I'm sure that'll be in the show notes.
It absolutely
And then my website, flipyourmindset.com. And my podcast, Flip Your Mindset. And there I really share, again, a lot of psychoeducation, a lot of language to maybe what people are experiencing. And if people are curious about a consultation, they can find it easily right on the website, flipyourmindset.com.
Beautiful. I love it. I follow Stacey and she's absolutely fantastic. I would recommend her to anybody. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, oh my gosh, how do I get this person? Absolutely do. Absolutely do work with Stacey. All right. So y'all, thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and don't forget to subscribe to the Indomitable podcast for more incredible stories of humaning. Remember, my new book, Indomitable, A Foster Care Story, is available wherever you get your books, and it actually has 5 stars on Goodreads, which I am super pumped about. So thank you to all of my friends who came out to visit me at the Copper Dog book signing. I was so touched and had such an amazing time. If you have places you'd like me to bring the Indomitable experience, please reach out to us. And finally, as ever, I am so happy to have you in community with me. And remember, together we are truly indomitable. Have a great week, everybody. Take care.